I've been asked on a few occasions about my stance on documentary hypothesis, and in getting to my take on the subject, we need to turn the clock back to the mid-1800s. Up until around 150 years ago, the assumption among biblical scholars was that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible himself. This is the Mosaic authorship concept. Now, somewhere around 150 years ago, someone figured out that Moses could not have written about his own death. It was a very subtle, sane, and reasonable concept that took 2,000 years for scholars to figure out. Out of this revelation that Moses obviously didn't write as a zombie, documentary hypothesis was presented. Now, this concept essentially put the Torah into a blender to see what would come out, and after this process, you had 4 different presumed authors. I won't go deep into documentary hypothesis at this moment because a lot of you have probably heard of it, and documentary hypothesis itself is not exactly where I'm heading with this video. Needless to say, documentary hypothesis was a vast improvement over Mosaic authorship. It explained the variations in text, but one small detail still reared its ugly head, and this goes back to Mosaic authorship. The whole point of assuming that Moses wrote it himself was to give the absolute earliest date possible for these works. The motives of biblical scholars are always suspect, because the overwhelming majority of biblical scholars are Christians or Catholics who are trying their best to preserve theology, and this problem bled through to documentary hypothesis. The new concept of authorship still maintained extremely early dates. There was no solid evidence for these dates, just like there was no evidence for Mosaic authorship, but documentary hypothesis people, doing their best to preserve theology, maintained early dates based solely on internal textual evidence. To demonstrate the problem of internal textual evidence, take Homer for example. Homer is writing about mythological events that are placed around 1200 BCE, yet Homer himself is not writing that early. He's writing somewhere around 800 BCE. If we were to take the evidence of documentary hypothesis and apply it to Homer, then Homer wrote around 1200. Documentary hypothesis takes the absolute weakest evidence and assumes that it means something that it does not mean. The dates given by documentary hypothesis are essentially trash. The dates are meaningless. The concept that multiple authors wrote the Torah is fascinating and probably correct, but the dates given by documentary hypothesis are extremely optimistic and early. Basing any date on internal textual evidence of this type is full of pitfalls and probably incorrect. My proposition with documentary hypothesis is to keep the concept of at least 4 authors, but to strike down the dates. The entire concept still makes sense if we were to date the Torah to 300 BCE or some other date supported by evidence. The documentary hypothesis dates are worthless. There is no evidence for these dates. I may go into the details around the 4 authors or groups of authors later. At this point, I only object to the dates given by documentary hypothesis, and I think my objection to those dates is rather easily explained. I would rather explore the evidence than fit the evidence to excessively early dates. I'm not trying to preserve theology, I'm trying to get to reality, and the dates given by documentary hypothesis can only be an obstruction to that process.